Find books your kids will want to read with engaging stories for kids, youth, and young adults, and nonfiction books to encourage and guide them on a purpose-driven life. The Wednesday Bookmark on CHRI.
Dan DeWitt leads the Center for Biblical Apologetics and Public Christianity at Cedarville University in Ohio, where he teaches courses on worldview and theology and apologetics and C.S. Lewis. And he has written several books for adults and kids and has published articles with Christianity Today, the Gospel Coalition, Relevant Magazine, and others. And his new kids' book glows in the dark. It's the bright light and the super scary darkness. It helps kids understand that even though the world can be a scary place, God's love will always outshine the dark. Welcome, author Dan DeWitt. Hi, Dan.
Thank you so much. It's great to be on the program.
So, Dan, I mentioned that you teach on C.S. Lewis, and I know you've written a few blogs on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Does your experience on the subject and Lewis's literary works influence your writing, especially for kids' books?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Lewis often used different methods to hit various target audiences. And so he wrote children's literature, he wrote apologetics, and Lewis has had a massive impact on the way I think about these topics and the way I try to communicate them. I don't pretend to be anywhere close to as good as Lewis, but he has influenced me.
Absolutely. When you use the words super scary darkness, and maybe this is where the influence comes in on terms of, you said, perspective, but when you use those words super scary darkness in this story, what do you mean? Like, what's the subtext here? What's the definition of those words when you were writing?
Well, yeah, I think, first of all, I've had a few people ask, like parents be apprehensive, like, oh, my child scares easily. I don't want, is this going to scare them? And it's not that the book itself is scary. It's certainly not. But the effects of sin are really what I'm getting at. The curse of sin, what the Bible talks about in Genesis 3, how all-encompassing the effects are of Adam and Eve's sin and our own sin. And that creates a darkness in the world. So you have this beautiful contrast throughout the New Testament of Jesus being the light of the world contrasted with the darkness of sin. And that's really what I'm trying to get at, that although sin is scary, that there's a bright light, Jesus, who outshines it all.
Now, and I love that you actually give darkness sounds in this book. Can you explain, just keep going on the track that you're on, you can certainly address the sounds thing, but explain how you approached this topic of dark and light.
Yeah, I try to. I have a running kind of, personification of the darkness, and so it's a little Calvin and Hobbes-esque in terms of this, the darkness making this noise. And, sometimes things are scary, especially when there's weird noises in the dark. And so throughout the book, it seems as though it's this really intimidating, kind of ominous sound the darkness is making. But really, when you get to the end of the book, you find that that's the sound the darkness makes when it's retreating. So you see that it's actually not the darkness being super scary. It's that because of Jesus, the darkness is a scaredy cat.
I love that. Explain a little bit more about how you tell this story, because you basically just tell the whole gospel story through the lens of darkness and light.
Yeah, it was really, for a long time, I've wanted to do something creative in terms of a overview of the big story of the Bible based on what the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians when he says, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,'" a clear reference to creation, he goes on to say, "hath shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in Jesus Christ." And so we have this, this motif of understanding the whole Bible in terms of God first speaking light. And now we've experienced this light, the light that God spoke into the world. That light has come into the world in the incarnation, and we have this treasure, as Paul says, in clay vessels, so that the excellency of the power might be of God and not of us. So I want to take that verse and just kind of overlay that, stretch it over the entire Bible, if you will, and say, look at how Paul does this, and that's what I attempt to do in the book, is kind of parallel what I think Paul does.
Now, we're talking about darkness in a lot of ways when it, again, like you said, contrasts light. And, of course, we already talk about sin versus Jesus. And I wonder if there's more in that term darkness that kids are feeling and they're relating to in this book. Can we go beyond that literal darkness? And what do you mean here?
Yeah, so we recognize that, first of all, the Apostle John picks up the idea of walking in darkness as a picture of sin. And we know that, bad things do happen in the dark, but bad things also happen in the daytime. And so this darkness is not just literally when the sun goes down, but it's a darkness that seems to fill our world. Sometimes it's even, for all of us, we know that we struggle with darkness ourselves, that there's a darkness in our own hearts where we're tempted to disobey God and disobey our parents, and to know that the hope of the gospel is that the light of Jesus is going to bring redemption through faith in him and what he's done for us, but then also that it has a way of allowing us to walk in the light. And so the darkness isn't just literal, although, there are themes I think can help kids, encourage them about a fear of the dark, but the deeper meaning is the spiritual darkness that shows up at night, but also during the day.
Yeah, so good. How do you, this may be a bigger question, but I know with your experience you can answer it, Dan, but how would you explain to a child why some people choose to love the dark more than the light?
Yeah, I think that, a child can understand wanting their own way, and they certainly understand that, the times that mommy and daddy ask you to do something, to quit playing, to turn the TV off, to do what, to come inside and stop playing outside. You kids understand that. I want to keep doing what I want to do. And essentially the reason that people love the darkness instead of loving God is because they would rather do their own thing. And whereas a Christian might struggle in certain areas where they'd really rather do their own thing and they feel convicted, often people who don't believe in God or don't want to worship God, they just apply that to all of life. So instead of it being this isolated event, Tommy, come inside, I don't want to, this person is just going to live their entire life with a disregard to who God is and to what God has said. And that's what I mean by loving the darkness more than the light.
Yeah. It's so good. I mean, even just what you said really sums up why this book is going to be a great tool for parents with their kids. As we wrap up, Dan, this is just, I want to ask you to leave us with this. What can kids remember to do when they're feeling scared or anxious?
Well, if I could add, too, for your listeners, the book is being translated into Spanish now. So if someone knows how it might be a resource to someone who speaks Spanish, that's going to be available, too.
Right.
But to your question, what can kids do? What they should do is to remind themselves that they're never alone, that God is always with them, and that no matter how dark things get, and we recognize kids are going to face not only temptations to disobey parents, but the results of other people's sins, the sin of their parents, and they're going to sense the darkness, and at times it's going to be really intimidating and scary and lonely, and to remember that God's with them, and that God will, at the end of all things, make everything right, and he will defeat the darkness, so the darkness doesn't win. But also, in addition to that, in those moments when they're tempted to disobey God or disobey their parents or their teacher or whatever the authorities are in their life, that's the darkness inviting them to love the darkness more than the light. And in those moments to make the decision, I don't want to love the darkness. I want to love the light, and I want to walk in the light.
Yeah, and remember, like you said, remember that the darkness actually is the scaredy cat, as you said.
That's right. Yes.
So good. Such a helpful interview, Dan. So much great stuff in there. Really appreciate it. The cover of the book, as I mentioned before, I was a little too excited about it, is glow in the dark, but there's lots of dark and light contrast in the illustrations. Again, it's The Bright Light and the Super Scary Darkness by Dan DeWitt. Thank you so much for your time today, Dan.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
To hear this interview again, or to discover more great books your kids will want to read, visit bookmark.chri.ca. The Wednesday Bookmark